would become active in this. And active isn't hard. Active means once a year you come to the legislature and ask, or you call your legislator and say, hey, we want you to support this. Or active means coming once a year to the legislator for a committee hearing, so that they see 30 people in the audience. You know how many, Sam, how many times did you see 30 people on one deal in one of your committee hearings?
Very rarely.
Right. And so, you know, in Texas, we had 400 people show up. And they had to put them out in the hall with so it's important. Your state representatives and state senators really care what you think. And that's why our founders thought most of the decisions ought to be made there, not in Washington. So I'm involved in this. This is my 29th state to be in this year. And I want to tell you, you don't accidentally get to Honolulu, right? and I'm 70 years old, and so I'm a little creaky now, and I'm really creaky after I've been sitting for 8.5 hours. And I'm sitting tonight because if I stand up, I'll have leg cramps tonight. So I don't want to do that. So let me tell you what I see is happening. Nothing's really happening in Washington except more of the same. I'm talking about the Congress. But what is happening in our country is slowly the risk of being not good stewards is going to take away opportunities for our kids. The second thing that's happening is the lack of character-based, visionary leadership is one of our biggest problems. When I talk to young people, you know, there's 85 million millennials. 85 million. They're the largest demographic. They're bigger than baby boomers now. There's more millennials than there are baby boomers. They have never seen a vibrant and successful America. They've never experienced it. They don't even know who Ronald Reagan was. And if you go and ask, less than 4% of the millennials know the three branches of the federal government. So let's go back to core values for a minute, and then we'll talk about what this process is and how it works and why we ought to be involved in it. I think there's 4 core values that are absolutely required for our republic to survive. One is a limited government. Well, we all know we don't have that anymore. So that's what the Convention of the States is about. Number 2 is a economic freedom that allows capital to go where it needs to go to benefit everybody. We're number 17th in the world now in terms of economic freedom. For 200 years, we were number 1. So if you ask yourself, the Federal Reserve's printed $4 trillion of extra money, and we're only growing at 2%, why is that? And that's because of over-regulation and inhibition of risk-taking due to regulation by the federal government. The third area, I said rule of law. No, I didn't. Did I say rule of law? No. Third area is rule of law. And if you think about it, rule of law is probably the most important thing, because if we lose confidence in the rule of law, like we're losing confidence in Washington, then all of a sudden it's whatever an individual decides is the law rather than we as a group decide is what the law is. And so when you go to Oklahoma or Arizona or Kansas or even Minnesota, when people talk about wanting to control our borders, it has nothing to do with anything that's racial. It has, and I heard this time and time again as I travel around the country. It's about the rule of law. And if you're not going to enforce that one, why would you enforce others on me? So it's the undermining of the rule of law that will eventually destroy us. And then the fourth thing is you got to have a virtuous and educated public. And what we know is, since 1976, the federal government has spent $3 trillion in education with not one parameter better than it was when they started. Doesn't matter what parameter you measure, not one of them's better. Thomas Jefferson, when asked when he was starting the University of Virginia and having trouble funding it, was asked by several people, why don't you go, you're a retired president of the United States, for goodness sakes, why don't you go ask them to help you? And he said, you don't understand. For the federal government to be involved in education would require an amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Isn't it interesting that once the federal government got involved in education, all the parameters and successes in education declined? In other words, what we're talking about is the decision-making was taken out of your hands and given to somebody in Washington that never taught anybody, that didn't know the children, didn't know the teachers, didn't know the district, didn't know the culture, didn't know the faith, didn't know the disciplinary structure. I'm going to end with a story about that, and you remind me if I don't. Okay. So what we have is a difficulty that matches every other republic in history, except we're the only one that hadn't failed yet. So I believe the reason